She didn't arrive in Montana looking for love. She came with a rifle, scars on her arm, and a past she never speaks about. But when a 12-year-old girl points a shotgun at her chest and a broken cowboy watches in silence, you realize this isn't just a ranch. It's a battlefield of grief, secrets, and survival. This story reminds us, sometimes the strongest people are those who choose to stay, when everyone else runs. Welcome to our channel, where we tell powerful Western stories of cowboys, frontier love. If this story pulls you in, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of our community.
Cora Sterling did not step off the westbound stagecoach with a parasol and a trunk full of lace. When the dust-caked wheels ground to a halt in the dying settlement of Oak Haven, Montana, she stepped down onto the cracked earth carrying a canvas rucksack and a scarred leather scabbard holding a Winchester .73. The stage driver, a man whose face looked like chewed leather, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "You sure about this, miss? The Hayes place is 5 miles out. Road's nothing but ruts and rattlesnakes. I can take you back to Bozeman on the return trip tomorrow." Cora adjusted the heavy strap of the rifle across her shoulder. Her hands, rough and calloused from years of gripping wagon reins and surviving winters that had claimed everyone she ever loved, didn't tremble. "I'm sure. Much obliged for the ride." She didn't wait to see the stagecoach roll away. Cora turned her face into the biting autumn wind and began to walk. 5 miles in the Montana Territory was not a stroll. It was a test of endurance. The landscape was a brutal, sweeping expanse of sagebrush and jagged foothills that looked as though they had been clawed from the earth by an angry god. The wind carried the scent of dry pine and incoming frost. With every step, Cora's worn leather boots kicked up small clouds of alkaline dust that coated her hem. She didn't mind the harshness. After surviving the Donner-like nightmare of the wagon train disaster 3 years ago in the Sierra Nevadas, a 5-mile walk in the dry cold was a luxury. She was alive. She had a destination. And according to the desperate, brief letter she had answered, there were children at the end of this road who needed keeping. A housekeeper, the advertisement had read. Must be willing to work. No questions asked. Room, board, and $10 a month. It was signed simply, W. Hayes. It took her 2 hours to reach the property line. The sight of the Hayes Ranch did not inspire hope. It was a sprawling acreage of magnificent, unforgiving land, but the homestead itself looked like it was slowly surrendering to the elements. The split-rail fences sagged, graying under the relentless sun. The barn doors hung at odd angles, and the main cabin, a sturdy 2-story structure of hand-hewn logs, seemed to possess a deep, hollow exhaustion. There were no flowers in the yard, no welcoming smoke spiraling cheerfully from the stone chimney. Just the stark, silent reality of a place where survival had completely eclipsed living. Cora walked up the dirt path, her hand instinctively resting on the stock of her Winchester. The silence of the yard was unnatural. No dogs barked, no children played. She stepped onto the creaking wooden porch, her knuckles raising to rap on the heavy oak door. Before her fist could make contact, the door swung inward with a sharp creak. Cora froze. Standing in the dim entryway was a girl who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Her dark hair was a tangled rat's nest. Her calico dress was stained with mud and grease, and her eyes, a striking, stormy gray, were feral. But what held Cora's absolute attention was the double-barreled shotgun the child had leveled directly at Cora's chest. "You take one more step, and I'll blow you back to town," the girl said. Her voice cracked, betraying her youth, but her finger rested dangerously close to the twin triggers. Cora didn't gasp. She didn't raise her hands in dramatic surrender. She simply looked down the dark, twin tunnels of the shotgun barrels. then met the girl's furious gaze. She recognized that look. It was the look of a cornered animal, terrified and willing to draw blood to protect its own. "The safety's off," Cora noted quietly, her voice smooth and level. "And your stance is too narrow. If you pull that trigger, the kickback is going to break your collarbone." The girl blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the lack of hysteria. "I ain't afraid of a broken bone." "Neither am I," Cora replied. "But I didn't walk 5 miles to bleed out on your porch. I'm Cora Sterling. I answered your father's letter." "We don't need you. The last 3 ran off crying. You should just turn around." "Abigail." The voice came from behind the girl, out of the shadows of the cabin's interior. It was a sound like stones grinding together at the bottom of a deep river. Low, rough, and vibrating with an authority that brooked absolutely no argument. A man stepped into the sliver of sunlight piercing the doorway. Wyatt Hayes was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and lean, moving with a deceptive, predatory grace. He wore a canvas workshirt dark with sweat and dust, his denim trousers tucked into scuffed riding boots. His face was a landscape of harsh angles, shadowed by a dark, untrimmed beard and a battered Stetson. But it was his eyes that struck Cora like a physical blow. They were the same stormy gray as his daughter's, but where Abigail's burned with wild fire, Wyatt's were dead. They were hollow, exhausted, and utterly devoid of light. He didn't yell. He didn't reprimand the girl. Wyatt simply reached out a large, calloused hand and wrapped his fingers around the twin barrels of the shotgun. He pushed the weapon down toward the floorboards with a slow, irresistible force. He slipped the weapon from her grasp, broke the action open, and plucked the 2 shells out, pocketing them in one fluid motion. Abigail glared at him, her jaw tight, but she didn't say a word. She spun on her heel and disappeared into the gloom of the house. Wyatt stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. He looked at Cora. He took in the dust on her clothes, the lack of a trunk, and the heavy Winchester slung over her shoulder. He didn't ask about the gun. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't even ask her name. He stepped back, leaving the doorway open. It wasn't a welcome. It was an allowance. Cora stepped inside. The cabin smelled of cold ash, stale grease, and deep, unwashed neglect. In the corner of the main room, a tiny, grubby toddler sat on a braided rug, clutching a headless doll, staring at Cora with wide, frightened eyes. Underneath the heavy oak dining table, Cora caught the gleam of another pair of eyes. A small boy, perhaps 6 years old, curled into a tight ball in the shadows. Wyatt walked past her, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He pointed a long, scarred finger toward a small alcove off the kitchen area. A narrow cot sat against the wall, sectioned off by a faded, moth-eaten curtain. "There," was the only word he spoke. It was the first and last word she heard from him that day. He didn't offer a tour. He didn't explain the children's routines. He set his hat low on his brow, picked up a coil of heavy rope from the table, and walked out the back door, leaving her entirely alone with 3 hostile, grieving children and a house that felt like a tomb. Cora didn't weep. She unslung her rifle, sliding it carefully under the mattress of the narrow cot. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing the jagged, pale burn scars that crawled up her left forearm, a permanent reminder of a wagon set ablaze in the snow. She found a bucket, a block of lye soap, and went to the pump. If they wanted her to run, they had severely underestimated her. Night fell over the Montana plains with a sudden, freezing finality. The children had refused the simple stew Cora had managed to cobble together from the barren pantry. Abigail had dragged the 2 younger ones up to the loft, barricading the door. Wyatt had not returned for supper. Cora lay on the narrow cot, fully dressed beneath a thin wool blanket. The silence of the house was oppressive, heavy with the ghosts of whoever had left this family so shattered. She closed her eyes, trying to will herself to sleep, but the cold seeped into her bones. At 2 a.m., a sound shattered the quiet. clang. Cora's eyes snapped open. Clang, clang. It was rhythmic, heavy, and metallic. It echoed from the direction of the outbuildings. Throwing off her blanket, Cora slipped her boots on and pulled her heavy shawl around her shoulders. She stepped out the back door into the biting frost. The moon was a silver sickle in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. The noise was coming from an open-sided shed near the barn. A dull orange glow pulsed in the darkness. Cora approached silently, her footsteps muffled by the frozen dirt. She stopped by the corner of the shed, staying in the shadows. It was Wyatt. He had stripped down to his thermal undershirt, the fabric clinging to the heavy muscles of his back and shoulders. He was standing before a roaring forge, holding a pair of tongs, gripping a glowing piece of iron. With a heavy blacksmith's hammer, he struck the metal against the anvil. Clang! Sparks showered around him like angry fireflies. The muscles in his arms bunched and strained with every blow. He wasn't just shaping a horseshoe, he was punishing the metal. He was punishing himself. Sweat gleamed on his skin despite the freezing temperature. His face was twisted in an expression of such raw, unadulterated agony that Cora had to press her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Every strike of the hammer felt like a scream he refused to vocalize. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, using physical exhaustion as an anchor to keep from being swept away entirely. Cora watched him for a long time in the freezing dark. She understood now. Wyatt Hayes wasn't a silent, callous brute who didn't care about his children. He was a man holding on to his sanity by his fingernails, terrified that if he opened his mouth, the grief would tear him and his family apart. She backed away slowly, retreating to the cold cabin. Tomorrow she wouldn't just be cleaning a house. She was going to war against the darkness that had consumed this ranch, and Cora Sterling had never lost a war. The first week at the Hayes Ranch was not a storybook tale of a kind-hearted woman melting the icy barriers of a broken family with sweet songs and warm cookies. It was, in every measurable way, sheer, unadulterated hell. Cora learned quickly that the ghost of the children's mother, Margaret, hung over the cabin like a suffocating shroud. The townspeople, the stage driver, everyone believed Margaret had been an angel taken too soon by a tragic accident. But angels didn't leave behind feral children and a husband who worked himself into a nightly stupor. On Tuesday morning, Cora woke before dawn. She managed to get the ancient cast-iron stove fired up and cooked a massive skillet of scrambled eggs, salt pork, and fried potatoes. The smell filled the cabin, a sharp contrast to the stale scent of neglect. Abigail came down the stairs first, her boots stomping aggressively. 3-year-old Bessie trailed behind her, clutching her sister's skirt, her face streaked with yesterday's dirt. 6-year-old Leo didn't come down the stairs. Cora saw his small, dirty toes protruding from beneath the floorboards near the root cellar trapdoor. He lived half his life hiding in the crawl space. Cora set a plate of hot food on the table. "Eat." Abigail stared at the food, then at Cora. Her gray eyes narrowed with a malice that was painfully sharp for a child. Without breaking eye contact, Abigail picked up the tin plate, walked to the back door, and unceremoniously scraped the entire steaming breakfast into the slop bucket meant for the pigs. She slammed the bucket down and turned back, crossing her arms, waiting for the explosion, waiting for Cora to scream, to cry, to pack her bags just like the 3 women before her. Cora didn't blink. She slowly wiped her hands on her apron. She didn't offer a motherly lecture about starving children elsewhere. She didn't offer a replacement meal. "Fine," Cora said, her voice flat, devoid of any emotional manipulation. "But when your stomach starts cramping around noon, don't come looking for biscuits. You can go chew on a fence post. The next meal is at sundown." Abigail's triumphant smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. This wasn't the script. Bessie, seeing the food disappear, immediately threw herself onto the floor and began to scream. It wasn't a normal toddler tantrum. It was a breathless, ear-piercing shriek of absolute abandonment. Cora didn't rush to scoop the child up. She knew that false comfort from a stranger would only escalate the panic. Instead, she knelt a few feet away, making herself small. She took a clean, warm biscuit from the pan, set it on a wooden block near the screaming toddler, and went back to washing the skillet. She ignored the noise, focusing on the rhythm of the chore. After 20 agonizing minutes, the screams subsided into hiccups, and a small, dirty hand reached out to snatch the biscuit. As for Leo, Cora didn't try to coax him out from under the floorboards with sweet words. She simply took a small tin plate, loaded it with eggs and pork, and slid it silently into the dark gap beneath the stairs, exactly as one would feed a stray, terrified pup. 10 minutes later, she checked. The plate was licked clean. No miracles, Cora thought as she scrubbed the cast iron. Just survival. Later that afternoon, Wyatt was out on the far ridge, mending fences he had likely mended 100 times before. Cora stepped out onto the back porch to shake out a rug. By the woodpile, Abigail was practicing. She had the heavy, double-barreled shotgun raised, aiming at a tin can perched on a stump 50 yards away. The gun was too big for her. She was leaning backward, compensating for the weight, her feet close together, her finger resting heavily on the trigger. Cora dropped the rug. She walked across the dusty yard, her boots making no sound. "You're going to miss the can," Cora said. Abigail jumped, whirling around, the barrels of the gun swinging dangerously toward Cora. "Mind your own business." Cora didn't flinch. She stepped forward, entirely within the kill zone of the weapon. "I am minding my business. If you fire that thing leaning back like that, the recoil is going to knock you flat on your back in the dirt. You'll bruise your shoulder so bad you won't be able to lift your arm for a week, and by the time you recover, whatever you were trying to shoot will have eaten you." Abigail glared, her pride warring with the logic. "My pa taught me." "Your pa taught you how to shoot when he was standing right behind you to catch you," Cora corrected smoothly. "You're alone now. You have to stand on your own 2 feet." Cora reached out. Abigail stiffened, but didn't pull away as Cora placed her calloused hands on the girl's thin shoulders. "Spread your feet," Cora instructed, her tone clinical, stripped of any maternal condescension. "Shoulder width apart. Drop your weight into your knees. Lean forward into the gun. You have to own the weapon, Abigail. Don't let the weapon own you." Abigail hesitantly adjusted her stance. She widened her legs, bending her knees slightly, shifting her center of gravity forward. "Tuck the stock tight into the pocket of your shoulder. Tighter. If there's a gap, it'll kick like a mule." Cora stepped back, examining the new posture. It was solid, grounded. "Keep both eyes open. Now, don't jerk the trigger. Squeeze it like you're holding a fragile egg." Abigail took a deep breath. She sighted down the barrel. The yard was dead silent. Boom! The shotgun roared, kicking violently against the girl's shoulder. But because she was leaning forward, Abigail absorbed the shock. She slid back an inch in the dirt. But she stayed on her feet. 50 yards away, the tin can violently exploded into the brush. Abigail lowered the smoking gun, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with shock and a sudden fierce pride. She looked at the spot where the can had been, then slowly turned her head to look at Cora. Cora didn't smile. She gave a single, firm nod of approval. "Clean the barrels before you put it away. Powder residue causes rust." She turned and walked back to the cabin. She had not won the girl's love, but in the harsh currency of the West, she had just purchased a sliver of respect. The next day, Cora turned her attention to the ranch itself. The cabin was clean, the children were fed, and Wyatt was, as usual, avoiding the house. Cora walked down to the barn, The massive double doors were a hazard. The lower iron hinge on the right door had snapped months ago, leaving the heavy wood sagging and dragging deep grooves into the dirt. It took Wyatt 10 minutes of grueling labor just to force it open every morning. Cora tied her hair back with a strip of leather. She found a heavy iron pry bar, a sledgehammer, and dug through the scrap pile until she found a thick iron bracket that could serve as a brace. For 3 hours under the punishing midday sun, Cora worked. She used the pry bar and heavy wooden blocks as leverage, utilizing the mechanical advantage she had learned when wagon wheels shattered on the Oregon Trail. She hoisted the massive door upward, groaning under the immense weight, sweat stinging her eyes. She wedged it into place, her muscles trembling with exhaustion. With her left hand holding the iron bracket in place, she swung the sledgehammer with her right. Whack! 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 The sound of iron driving into ancient wood echoed across the valley. She didn't notice the rider approaching until a shadow fell over her. Cora lowered the sledgehammer, wiping her brow with the back of her dusty arm. Wyatt sat atop his massive roan gelding 15 feet away. He had ridden in silently. He was staring at the barn door. It hung straight now, the gap at the bottom perfectly even. He shifted his gaze to Cora. He took in her flushed face. The dirt streaked across her cheeks. The heavy sledgehammer held easily in her scarred hands. For a long moment, the silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. Cora didn't explain herself. She didn't ask for praise or point out how hard she had worked. She simply met his intense, stormy gaze, her chin tilted up in silent challenge. "I am not a fragile thing to be broken," her posture said. Wyatt's jaw tightened. The muscle in his cheek ticked. Slowly, deliberately, he raised a gloved hand and touched the brim of his Stetson in a silent, respectful salute. He spurred his horse and rode past her into the barn. He hadn't spoken a single word, but as Cora leaned the sledgehammer against the wall, her heart executed a strange, hard rhythm against her ribs. In the language of a man who had forgotten how to speak, that tip of the hat was a shout. It meant he saw her, not as a maid, not as a replacement, but as a survivor, standing shoulder to shoulder with him in the ashes of his life. Winter in the Montana Territory did not arrive with a gentle frost. It descended like a falling broadsword. By the end of Cora's third week at the Hayes Ranch, the temperature had plummeted, turning the mud of the yard into iron-hard ridges and freezing the water in the pumps solid by midnight. Wyatt had been gone for 2 days. He had ridden out to the high summer pastures to track down a dozen stray heifers that had wandered too close to the jagged ridgeline before the snows hit. He had left no instructions, only a brief, silent nod toward the woodshed, indicating she should keep the fires burning. Cora understood the unspoken weight of his absence. He was trusting her not to abandon his children to the ice. She would sooner cut off her own arm than betray that silent, fragile trust. It was a Tuesday night, the kind of night where the wind howled down the chimney throat like a dying animal. The cabin was swathed in the heavy darkness that comes when the moon is smothered by thick, bruising snow clouds. The children were asleep. Abigail had finally stopped barricading the loft door, a small concession that Cora took as a hard-won victory. Leo was tucked into his cot under the stairs, and Bessie was curled in a nest of blankets near the stove. Cora was awake, sitting in the rocking chair by the dying embers, a heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders. She was mending a tear in one of Wyatt's flannel shirts, her needle flashing silver in the dim, pulsing orange light of the coals. Then, the frantic, high-pitched barking began. It was Buster, the ancient, half-blind sheepdog that usually slept under the front porch. He wasn't just barking at a passing coyote or a shadow. The sound was frantic, hysterical, and distinctly laced with terror. It was followed almost immediately by a sound that made the blood in Cora's veins turn to ice. The panicked, chaotic bleating of the small flock of merino sheep penned behind the main barn, accompanied by the distinct heavy thud of wooden rails splintering. Wolves. Cora didn't hesitate. The survival instincts forged in the frozen hell of the Sierra Nevadas kicked in with ruthless efficiency. She dropped the sewing, threw off the blanket, and shoved her feet into her heavy leather boots, not bothering to lace them. She grabbed her heavy canvas coat from the peg by the door. In one smooth motion, she reached beneath her cot and pulled out the Winchester 73. She checked the magazine by touch, fully loaded. Abigail appeared at the top of the loft stairs, holding a flickering candle, her gray eyes wide with alarm. "What is it?" "Wolves in the sheep pen," Cora said, her voice a sharp, flat command that left no room for panic. "Come down here. Keep the fire stoked. Keep your brother and sister behind the table. If anything comes through that door that isn't me or your father, you shoot it. Do you understand?" Abigail swallowed hard, the tough facade slipping just enough to show the terrified 12-year-old beneath. But she nodded, her chin trembling only slightly. "I understand." "Lock the heavy bolt behind me." Cora threw open the door and stepped into the freezing void, the wind immediately biting into the exposed skin of her face like ground glass. She heard the heavy iron bolt slide into place behind her. Good girl. The yard was a chaotic nightmare of shadows and noise. Cora racked the lever of the Winchester, chambering around. The metallic clack-clack was swallowed by the roaring wind. She ran toward the barn, her unlaced boots slipping on the frozen ruts. As she rounded the corner of the weathered structure, the scene illuminated itself in the pale, shifting starlight. The heavy wooden gate of the sheep pen had been battered down. Inside the enclosure, absolute carnage reigned. The sheep were a swirling mass of white wool slamming into the fences in blind panic. And among them were the wolves. Timber wolves, massive and desperate with early winter hunger. There were at least 4 of them, moving like dark, fluid smoke through the flock. Buster was in the center of the fray. The old dog, well past his prime and lacking the teeth for a real fight, was valiantly trying to put himself between a massive alpha male and a downed ewe. The wolf snapped, its jaws closing on the dog's flank, tossing Buster aside like a rag doll. The dog yelped, a sound of pure agony, and hit the frozen dirt, struggling to rise. Cora didn't shout. Shouting was a waste of breath and focused a predator's attention. She raised the Winchester, tucking the stock firmly into the pocket of her shoulder, letting her cheek meld with the cold wood. She tracked the massive alpha male as it turned from the dog back toward the flock. She exhaled, a plume of white vapor in the dark, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, spitting a tongue of yellow flame into the night. The heavy .44-40 bullet struck the alpha squarely behind the shoulder. The massive beast didn't even yelp. It simply folded, dropping like a stone into the bloody snow. The gunshot momentarily stunned the remaining pack. They froze, turning their glowing yellow eyes toward the darkness where Cora stood. She worked the lever action with lightning speed. Clack, clack. She fired again. A second wolf, leaner and smaller, took a glancing blow to the hindquarters, spinning wildly with a sharp yelp before bolting toward the tree line. But the third and fourth wolves didn't run. Starvation makes predators bold, and Cora was standing between them and their kill. They separated, moving with terrifying tactical precision, circling the perimeter of the pen to flank her. Cora backed up slowly, keeping the barn wall to her left so nothing could sneak up behind her. She tracked the third wolf, waiting for it to step out of the chaotic mass of panicking sheep. It lunged, clearing the low fence in a single terrifying leap, jaws snapping for her throat. Cora fired, but the wolf was already airborne. The bullet grazed its ribcage. The heavy animal crashed into her, knocking the breath from her lungs and sending her sprawling backward into the frozen mud. The Winchester flew from her grasp, skittering out of reach. A hot, putrid breath washed over her face. The wolf was on top of her, its claws scrabbling for purchase on her heavy canvas coat. Cora brought her arms up, crossing them over her throat just as the beast's jaws clamped down. Its teeth sank into the thick canvas of her left forearm, tearing through the fabric and biting deep into the flesh beneath. The pain was immediate, a blinding, white-hot flare that made her vision swim. Cora didn't scream. She reached down with her free right hand, her fingers closing frantically around the handle of the heavy skinning knife she kept sheathed on her belt. She ripped it free. With a guttural grunt of pure primal exertion, she drove the 6-inch blade upward, burying it to the hilt in the soft underside of the wolf's throat. Hot, thick blood sprayed across her face and chest. The wolf convulsed, its jaws releasing her arm in a wet gasp, and collapsed heavily on top of her. Cora shoved the dead weight off, gasping for air, the metallic tang of blood filling her mouth and nose. She scrambled to her knees, grabbing her rifle from the dirt, ready for the fourth wolf. But the sound of the struggle, the death of the packmates, had broken the fourth predator's nerve. It was already a receding shadow, fleeing toward the timberline. Silence rushed back into the yard, save for the wind and the pathetic, ragged breathing of the wounded sheep and the old dog. Cora stayed on her knees for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving behind a cold, shaking exhaustion. Her left arm was throbbing with a sickening rhythm. She looked down. The sleeve of her coat was shredded, the fabric growing dark and heavy with her own blood. She forced herself to stand. She couldn't afford shock. Not yet. She limped over to Buster. The old dog whimpered, licking her bloodied hand as she inspected his flank. It was a bad tear, but not fatal. "You did good, old man," she whispered, her voice rasping in the freezing air. "You held the line." She spent the next hour working in the brutal cold. She dragged the wolf carcasses away from the pens to prevent the scent from panicking the sheep further. She propped up the broken gate using heavy timber blocks, securing the surviving flock. Only when the perimeter was safe did she allow herself to trudge back to the cabin, Buster limping weakly at her heels. When she knocked on the heavy oak door, Abigail unbolted it instantly. The girl's eyes widened in sheer horror as Cora stepped into the light. Cora looked like she had walked through a slaughterhouse. Her coat was soaked in dark, freezing blood. Her face was smeared with crimson, her hair tangled with mud and snow. She was cradling her left arm against her chest, her face pale as parchment. "Get my medical kit from my rucksack," Cora ordered, her voice completely steady despite the fact that the room was beginning to tilt on its axis. "Boil water, lots of it." Before Abigail could move, the sound of heavy hoofbeats echoed in the yard. The door was pushed open wider. Wyatt stood on the threshold. He had ridden hard, his horse lathered and steaming in the cold. He had heard the gunshots from a mile out. His stormy eyes swept the room, taking in Abigail's terror, the children huddled by the stove and finally landing on Cora. The exhaustion in his face vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute terrifying intensity. He didn't ask what happened. The blood told the story. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides. "Sit," he commanded, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. He didn't wait for her to comply. He gripped her right shoulder and guided her firmly into a chair by the dining table. "Wolves," Cora managed to say, her teeth beginning to chatter as the cold and shock finally set in. "Got the alpha. Gate is secure. Buster needs stitching." Wyatt ignored the report. He was staring at her left arm. "Abigail, fetch the whiskey from the top shelf and clean rags." He knelt beside Cora. His massive hands, usually so rough and intimidating, were surprisingly gentle as he took her injured arm. The canvas coat was practically glued to her skin with freezing blood. "I have to cut the sleeve," he said, his eyes meeting hers. It wasn't a request for permission, but a warning. Cora nodded tightly. "Do it." Wyatt pulled a sharp pocket knife from his trousers and carefully sliced through the thick canvas and the flannel shirt beneath, peeling the ruined fabric away. As the cloth fell away, the bloody bite marks were revealed. Deep punctures and a jagged tear near her bicep. But that wasn't what made Wyatt freeze. Beneath the fresh blood and the torn flesh, spanning from her wrist all the way up over her shoulder, was a tapestry of horrific silver-pink burn scars. They were old, deeply ridged, and spoke of an unimaginable fiery agony. The skin was puckered and tight, a permanent map of a past she had never spoken of. Wyatt stared at the scars, the knife going still in his hand. He looked up at her face. Her expression was guarded, a high wall erected instantly to deflect pity or horror. Wyatt offered neither. He didn't ask about the fire. He didn't flinch. He simply shifted his gaze back to the fresh wolf bite. Abigail arrived with the whiskey and hot water. Wyatt took the bottle, uncorking it with his teeth. "This is going to burn." "I know what fire feels like, Mr. Hayes," Cora said quietly. "Pour it." He poured the raw liquor directly over the open wounds. Cora's jaw locked. Her entire body went rigid, a choked hiss escaping her lips, but she didn't pull away. She gripped the edge of the wooden table with her good hand so hard her knuckles turned white. Wyatt worked in absolute silence. He cleaned the wounds with hot water, his large fingers deft and precise. He threaded a needle from her kit and stitched the deepest tear with the practiced ease of a man used to patching up livestock and himself. Throughout the ordeal, the physical proximity between them was suffocating. She could smell the pine and horse sweat on him, feel the heat radiating from his broad chest. When he finally tied off the last stitch, he wrapped the arm tightly in clean linen. He didn't move away immediately. He remained kneeling beside her chair, his face inches from hers. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the exhaustion, the pain, the dirt, and the unyielding steel in her eyes. He looked at the woman who had fought off a pack of starving wolves alone in the dark rather than wake his terrified daughter. "You don't have to risk your life for my property," Wyatt said. His voice was a low, rough whisper, meant only for her. It was the most he had spoken to her since she arrived. The words were laced with a heavy, confusing mixture of anger and a desperate, reluctant gratitude. Cora looked back into those stormy gray eyes. The deadness in them had receded, replaced by a turbulent, burning awareness. "I didn't do it for your sheep, Wyatt," she replied, her voice equally low, holding his gaze without a fraction of hesitation. "I protect what I consider home." Wyatt's breath hitched just a fraction. His gaze dropped to her mouth for a heartbeat, then back to her eyes. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of her words, heavy with a sudden, overwhelming tension that had nothing to do with wolves or blood. He didn't reply. He slowly stood up, took the medical kit, and went out to the porch to sew up the dog. But as the door clicked shut behind him, Cora knew something fundamental had shifted. The cowboy was still silent, but the wall between them had finally begun to crack. By the end of the 4th week, the deep freeze had broken slightly, giving way to a muddy gray thaw. Cora's arm was healing clean, a testament to Wyatt's precise stitching and her own rugged constitution. The dynamic on the ranch had settled into a rhythm of silent, shared labor. Wyatt still rarely spoke, but he no longer avoided the cabin entirely. He would sit by the fire, sharpening his tools while Cora read to the children, his presence a heavy, grounding anchor in the room. But peace in the Montana Territory was usually an illusion, a brief pause before the next storm. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the form of a shiny black carriage pulled by 2 matched bays. The rig was entirely out of place on the rugged, rutted road leading to the Hayes Ranch. It spoke of banking houses, imported whiskey, and town money. Cora was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, her injured arm throbbing dull ache as she pinned wet shirts. She watched the carriage roll into the yard. The man who stepped down was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, a silver-tipped walking stick in one hand and a bowler hat in the other. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with slicked-back dark hair and eyes the color of old ice. He looked around the dusty, weathered yard, wrinkling his nose as if the very air of the ranch offended him. This was Silas Thorne. Wyatt emerged from the barn. The moment he saw the carriage, Cora watched his entire posture change. The quiet, exhausted rancher vanished. Wyatt's shoulders squared, his hands dropping to rest loosely at his sides, inches from the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his thigh. He looked like a coiled spring vibrating with a suppressed, lethal violence. Silas smiled, a thin, patronizing curving of his lips. "Wyatt, good to see you're still scratching a living out of this dirt." "Thorne," Wyatt grunted, his voice dropping to a gravelly threat. "You're off your usual path. Town is 5 miles that way." "Oh, I know where town is," Silas said smoothly, stepping closer, twirling his walking stick. "But business brings me out to the edge of civilization. I trust you received my notice from the bank?" "I got it." "Good. Then you know the $500 is due in exactly 1 month. Full principal and interest. The grace period your late wife negotiated has unfortunately expired. Cora, standing near the corner of the cabin, froze. $500. In this economy, for a struggling rancher, that wasn't a debt. It was a death sentence. It was the price of the entire property. Silas's icy eyes drifted past Wyatt and landed on Cora. He took in her faded dress, her pinned-back hair, and the bandage wrapped around her arm. His smile widened into something oily and insulting. "I see you found a replacement," Silas drawled, his tone dripping with condescension. "A bit rough around the edges compared to Margaret, isn't she? Though I suppose beggars can't be choosers. Does this one know how to properly warm a bed, Wyatt? Or is she just here to slop the pigs?" Wyatt took a half-step forward, his hand twitching toward his gun. "You watch your mouth, Silas. She's the housekeeper. You address her with respect, or I'll wire your jaw shut." Silas chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. "My apologies. I meant no offense to the hired help." Just then, the front door of the cabin creaked open. Abigail stepped out onto the porch, holding a bucket of wash water. She stopped dead when she saw Silas. Her face went pale, her knuckles turning white on the bucket's handle. "Mr. Thorne," Abigail whispered, her voice tight with an emotion Cora couldn't quite place. It wasn't just dislike. It was a deep, confusing resentment. Silas turned his predatory charm on the 12-year-old. "Little Abigail, look how you've grown. You're looking more like your dear mother every day. It's a tragedy she's not here to see it." Wyatt stepped between Silas and his daughter, using his broad body as a physical shield. "State your business and get off my land." "I told you my business," Silas said, stepping back slightly, though his eyes never lost their cruel amusement. 1 month, Wyatt. I want the money, or I take the deed. The bank won't extend credit to a man who can barely keep his fences upright." "You'll get your money." "I highly doubt that," Silas sneered. He turned as if to walk back to his carriage, then paused, executing a perfect theatrical pivot. "Oh, before I forget, I brought something back." Silas reached into his tailored waistcoat pocket. He withdrew his hand and held it out. Dangling from his manicured fingers was a delicate silver hairpin, adorned with a cluster of iridescent pearls. It was an exquisite, expensive piece of jewelry, completely incongruous with the dust and poverty of the ranch. Abigail gasped, taking a step back, the wash bucket dropping from her hands. The water splashed over the porch, but no one noticed. "Found this in the velvet cushions of my carriage a while back," Silas said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet yard. He wasn't looking at Abigail anymore. He was looking directly into Wyatt's eyes, delivering the strike with calculated precision. "Must have slipped from Margaret's hair when she visited town. She always did love taking rides in my carriage. Said it was much smoother than bouncing around in a farm wagon." Silas let the pearl hairpin drop. It fell into the muddy dirt at Wyatt's boots. Abigail didn't understand the full, sick implication of the words, but she recognized her mother's favorite hairpin, the one Margaret had supposedly been wearing the day she died. The girl looked between her father and the banker, confused and horrified. Cora understood perfectly. The breath left her lungs. It wasn't just a taunt about a debt. It was a vicious public declaration of infidelity. Silas was rubbing Wyatt's face in the fact that he had bedded Margaret Hayes. Wyatt stared at the pearl hairpin in the mud. The silence that followed was not the quiet, brooding silence Cora had grown used to. It was the silence of a lit fuse hitting a powder keg. "Abigail," Wyatt said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "Go inside." "But Pa, go inside. Now." Abigail fled, slamming the door. Wyatt didn't draw his gun. Shooting an unarmed man, even a snake like Silas, was murder. But the law of the West didn't protect a man from a beating he had begged for. Wyatt moved with explosive, blinding speed. He closed the distance between them before Silas could even raise his walking stick. Wyatt's massive fist connected with Silas's jaw with a sickening crack that echoed off the barn walls. Silas was lifted off his feet, crashing backward into the side of his shiny black carriage. The walking stick clattered to the dirt. Silas scrambled to stay upright, spitting a mouthful of blood, his eyes wide with sudden panic. He fumbled inside his tailored coat, reaching for a hidden derringer. Wyatt didn't give him the chance. He grabbed Silas by the lapels of his expensive suit, hauling him forward, and buried his fist into the banker's stomach. Silas doubled over, gasping for air. Wyatt brought his knee up, smashing it into Silas's face. Blood exploded from Silas's nose. He collapsed into the mud, groaning, desperately trying to crawl away. Wyatt was a man possessed. Months of repressed agony, of silent humiliation, of working himself to the bone to cover the sins of a wife who had betrayed him. All of it boiled over into raw, unfiltered violence. He stood over Silas, grabbed him by the collar, dragging him through the muck, and slammed a heavy boot down on the banker's reaching hand. Bones crunched. Silas shrieked. Wyatt drew his arm back, his knuckles already split and bleeding, aiming for a blow that would likely crush Silas's skull. "Wyatt, stop!" Cora ran forward, grabbing Wyatt's raised arm with her uninjured hand. She dug her heels into the dirt, pulling with all her weight. "He's not worth the noose!" Cora shouted, her voice cutting through the red haze of his rage. "Wyatt, look at me! If you kill him, they take your kids! Stop!" Wyatt froze. His chest heaved like a bellows, his breathing ragged and harsh. He stared down at the bloody, broken mess of the banker at his feet. Slowly, agonizingly, the murderous tension drained from his shoulders. He lowered his arm, shaking Cora off gently, but stepping back. Silas coughed, spitting a tooth into the mud. He clutched his broken hand, his tailored suit ruined, his face a swollen mask of blood and hatred. He struggled to his knees, leaning against the carriage wheel. "You're a dead man, Hayes," Silas wheezed, his voice bubbling with blood. "I'm going to take this ranch. I'm going to take everything. And when I kick you and your brats out into the snow, I'll make sure everyone in town knows exactly what a whore your precious Margaret really was." Wyatt didn't react to the threat. His rage had burned out, leaving only the cold, exhausted ash behind. "Get off my land," Wyatt said, turning his back on the man. Silas's driver, who had been hiding behind the carriage, hurriedly helped his battered boss into the cab. The horses were whipped into a frantic gallop, the carriage tearing out of the yard, leaving deep, erratic tracks in the mud. The yard was silent again. Wyatt stood in the center of the muddy driveway. He looked down at his right hand. His knuckles were split open, bleeding freely, the skin torn and embedded with dirt. He didn't seem to feel the pain. Slowly his gaze dropped to the ground. There, half buried in the muck and stained with Silas's blood, was the pearl hairpin. Wyatt stared at it. He didn't bend down to pick it up. He just stared at the physical proof of his deepest shame, lying in the dirt for anyone to see. The illusion of the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect tragedy was shattering. Cora stepped up beside him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't ask questions. She simply reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a clean white handkerchief, and pressed it firmly into his bleeding hand. Wyatt's fingers closed over hers, holding the cloth, holding her hand, gripping it like a lifeline in a turbulent sea. He didn't look at her, but he didn't let go. "1 month," Wyatt whispered to the wind, a sound of absolute defeat. Cora looked at the pearl hairpin in the mud, then at the bruised, silent man beside her. She knew a thing or two about impossible odds. "Then we have a month to figure it out," Cora said. She turned her hand over, intertwining her fingers with his bloody ones, squeezing tight. The cowboy stayed silent, but his grip tightened in return, anchoring them both to the earth. The air in the cabin had been thick and suffocating ever since Silas Thorne's black carriage had rolled out of the yard, leaving the bloody pearl hairpin half buried in the mud. Abigail had retreated into a hostile silence, her gray eyes dark with questions she was too terrified to ask. Leo had spent 2 days tucked tightly beneath the stairs, and Bessie clung to Cora's skirts with a desperate, heavy need, sensing the fractured foundation of her home. Wyatt had retreated into his labor. He was a ghost haunting his own property, rising hours before dawn and returning long after the children were asleep. He was running from the ghost of the pearl hairpin, from the shame that Silas had so casually dragged into the light. On a freezing Tuesday morning, Cora decided the only way to combat the creeping despair was through relentless, punishing work. The winter was closing in tight, and the root cellar needed a complete inventory and reorganization if they were going to survive on the meager supplies they had left. She lit a kerosene lantern, pulled her heavy shawl tight around her shoulders, and descended the steep earthen steps beneath the kitchen floorboards. The cellar was a cavernous, damp space, smelling of dry dirt, sprouting potatoes, and old wood. Shadows danced wildly against the stone foundation as the lantern light flickered. Cora set to work. She hauled out rotten burlap sacks, sorted the remaining root vegetables, and scrubbed the wooden shelves with a mixture of vinegar and water. For 3 hours, she lost herself in the rhythm of the chore, the physical exertion a welcome distraction from the heavy, unspoken tension upstairs. She was clearing the farthest, darkest corner of the cellar, moving a heavy stack of empty wooden crates when she noticed it. The floor of the cellar was packed earth, hardened by years of foot traffic. But beneath the bottom crate, the dirt was loose. It hadn't been packed down. In fact, there was a distinct rectangular depression in the soil, partially covered by a rotting piece of canvas. Cora paused, her brow furrowing. She knelt, setting the lantern on the ground beside her. With her good hand, she pulled the canvas back. Beneath it lay a heavy, iron-bound wooden chest. It was small, no larger than a hat box, but padlocked with a heavy brass mechanism. The wood was coated in a thick layer of dust, completely untouched. A strange, cold prickle crawled up Cora's spine. A mother's mementos, baby clothes, family Bibles, pressed flowers, were usually kept in the house, cherished and accessible. You didn't bury love in the dirt beneath the floorboards. You buried secrets. She hesitated. This was Wyatt's home, Wyatt's past. It was not her place to pry. But Silas Thorne's threat echoed in her mind. I'll make sure everyone in town knows exactly what a whore your precious Margaret really was. Wyatt was drowning under a $500 debt, and this box had been deliberately hidden. If there was a chance, even a fraction of a chance, that something in this box could help them, she had to know. Cora stood, marched up the stairs to the kitchen, and retrieved a heavy iron chisel and a hammer from Wyatt's indoor toolbox. She returned to the cellar, her jaw set. She wedged the chisel into the shackle of the brass padlock. With 2 sharp, deafening strikes of the hammer, the old brass gave way with a metallic snap. Cora tossed the broken lock aside. She took a deep breath, the damp cellar air filling her lungs, and lifted the heavy wooden lid. The smell of dried lavender and stale perfume wafted up, sweet and entirely out of place in the earthy dark. Inside, there were no baby booties. There were no journals filled with loving prayers for Abigail, Leo, and Bessie. The first thing Cora pulled out was a stack of stiff, cream-colored cards. She held them to the lantern light. They were promissory notes. I owe us. But they weren't for seed, feed, or farming equipment. They were stamped with the ornate logo of the Silver Spur Saloon and Casino in Bozeman. Dozens of them. Debts for poker, faro, and roulette, all signed in a looping, elegant, feminine script. Margaret Hayes. The numbers were staggering. $50 here, $100 there. The dates stretched back 3 years. Cora's stomach plummeted. Margaret hadn't been an angel keeping the family together. She had been bleeding the ranch dry. Beneath the gambling markers lay a small black velvet pouch. Cora opened it, dumping the contents into her palm. A gold pocket watch, a diamond brooch, a pair of silver cufflinks. These weren't things a struggling rancher's wife owned. These were things a desperate gambler accepted in pawn, or worse, stole. But it was the paper resting at the very bottom of the chest, that made the air freeze in Cora's lungs. It was a thick envelope, the seal already broken. Inside was a letter, written on expensive perfumed stationery, alongside 2 rectangular stubs of heavy cardstock. Cora looked at the stubs first. They were tickets: Union Pacific Railroad, first class, Bozeman to San Francisco. They were dated for the exact week Margaret had died. There were 2 of them. With trembling hands, Cora unfolded the letter. The looping handwriting was the same as the I O us, but the words were hurried, frantic, and dripping with a venom that made Cora feel physically sick. Silas, I cannot stand another night in this wretched cabin. The smell of dirt and cattle makes me want to scream. Wyatt is a dull, plodding fool who thinks calluses are a substitute for ambition, and the children are a constant, suffocating weight around my neck. Abigail looks at me with those judging eyes, just like her father. I loathe them all. I have secured the $500 from the ranch's operating fund. Wyatt thinks it went to the bank yesterday to clear the mortgage, but I have it stitched into my traveling coat. It is enough for us to start over in California. Have the carriage waiting at the crossroads at midnight on Thursday. Do not be late. If I have to spend one more winter freezing in this miserable territory, playing the devoted wife to a dirt farmer, I will go mad. Yours, Margaret. Cora dropped the letter as if it had caught fire. It fluttered to the packed earth, the elegant handwriting mocking the devastating truth it contained. Margaret Hayes hadn't died in a tragic accident while running errands. She had been running away. She had abandoned her 3 children, stolen the money meant to save their home, and was fleeing with the man who was now trying to destroy them. And Wyatt had known. He had found her body in that wrecked carriage alongside Silas, who had miraculously survived. Oh, Wyatt, Cora thought, a wave of profound, crushing sorrow washing over her. She didn't hear the heavy footsteps on the wooden stairs until the shadow fell over her. Cora gasped, spinning around. Wyatt stood at the bottom of the cellar stairs. The lantern light threw harsh, demonic shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the hollow exhaustion in his eyes. He was looking at the broken padlock, the open chest, and the scattered papers. His gaze slowly tracked down to the perfumed letter resting in the dirt at Cora's feet. The silence in the cellar was absolute, heavier than the earth pressing in around them. Cora scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She didn't try to hide the papers or make excuses. Wyatt, I was cleaning. The dirt was loose. Her voice faltered. There was no apology sufficient for unearthing a man's deepest, most humiliating wound. Wyatt didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't explode into the violent rage she had witnessed in the yard with Silas. Instead, he crumbled. It wasn't a physical collapse, but the sudden, devastating shattering of a dam that had held back an ocean of agony for too long. His broad shoulders slumped, the formidable, intimidating presence of the cowboy entirely vanishing. He looked suddenly frail, an exhausted man carrying a mountain on his back who had finally run out of strength to take another step. He walked forward, his boots heavy, and slowly sank to his knees in the dirt beside the open trunk. His large, calloused hands that could break a wild stallion or forge hot iron, trembled violently as he reached out and picked up the letter. He didn't read it. He knew exactly what it said. He had probably read it 1,000 times in the dark. She was leaving me, Wyatt whispered. The sound of his voice, so raw, so unused, scraping painfully against his throat, broke Cora's heart completely. It wasn't the gravelly bark of a rancher giving orders. It was the voice of a broken boy. I know, Cora said softly, dropping to her knees beside him. She told me she was going to town to buy winter coats for the kids, Wyatt continued, staring blankly at the paper, the words tumbling out of him now that the dam was broken. The silence he had maintained for months was finally over. She smiled at me, kissed my cheek. And all the while, she had the deed money sewn into her lining. Silas was waiting for her in his carriage at the crossroads. They were making a run for the station. He let the letter fall back into the dirt. He raised his hands, pressing the heels of his palms hard against his eyes, as if trying to push the memories back into the dark. The horses spooked. A washout on the ridge road. The carriage went over the embankment. Silas got thrown clear into the brush, broke his collarbone. But he lived. Wyatt's voice hitched, a dry, terrible sound. The carriage rolled. It crushed her. I found them the next morning when she didn't come home. Silas was gone, fled back to town like a coward. I found the tickets in her coat. And I found the money missing. Silas took it before he ran. He took the $500 she stole from me, and now he's using the bank to demand it back. Cora felt a hot surge of homicidal rage toward Silas Thorne. Wyatt, you have to tell the sheriff. You have the letter. You have the IOUs. You can prove Silas stole the money, that he was involved. No! Wyatt's hands dropped from his face. His gray eyes were bloodshot, bright with unshed tears, and a fierce, desperate panic. No. No one can know. You can't tell anyone. Why? Cora demanded, her voice rising in disbelief. Wyatt, he's destroying you. He's going to take your ranch. He's holding a debt he stole from your wife. Because if I expose him, I expose her, Wyatt roared, the sound echoing off the stone walls. If I go to the law, the whole town will know. They'll know Margaret was a thief, a cheat, a whore who ran off with the town banker. It will be in the papers. People will whisper about it for the next 20 years. Let them whisper. It's the truth. It's the children's truth. Wyatt grabbed Cora by the upper arms, his grip bruising, desperate. He pulled her closer, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and ragged. Think about Abigail. Think about Leo. They lost their mother. It broke them. Leo hasn't spoken a single word since the day I carried her body home. Abigail is so full of anger she can barely breathe. The only thing keeping them together is the belief that their mother loved them, that she was an angel who died too soon. Wyatt let go of her, sinking back on his heels, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean line through the dust on his cheek. If I tell them the truth, if I let them know that she hated them, that she called them a suffocating weight, that she abandoned them for another man. Wyatt shook his head frantically, burying his face in his hands. It would destroy them, Cora. It would kill whatever soul they have left. I won't let her break them from the grave. I won't do it. Cora stared at the man kneeling in the dirt. Suddenly, everything made horrific, perfect sense. The silence. The midnight forging. The refusal to defend himself against Silas's taunts. Wyatt wasn't silent because he didn't care. He was silent because every word he didn't speak was a brick in the fortress he was building to protect his children's fragile hearts. He was willingly absorbing the shame, the debt, the town's pity, and Silas's abuse, just so his children could hold on to the illusion of a mother who loved them. He was letting himself be crushed to keep them safe. He was drowning to keep them dry. Cora felt her own tears hot and fast on her cheeks. She reached out, her scarred left hand grasping his thick wrist, her good hand coming up to cup the side of his rough, bearded face. "Wyatt," she whispered, "look at me." He slowly lowered his hands. His gray eyes met hers, utterly stripped of his armor, completely vulnerable. "You are the strongest man I have ever met," Cora said, her voice fierce, trembling with absolute conviction. "You have carried a burden no man should have to carry, but you are wrong." Wyatt blinked, confusion cutting through his grief. "You think you are protecting them with this lie," Cora continued, her thumb brushing away the tear on his cheek. "But the lie is poisoning this house. Abigail feels your anger, and because she doesn't know where it comes from, she aims it at herself, at me, at the world. Leo feels your silence, so he stops speaking. You are bleeding out, Wyatt, and your children are drowning in the blood. "I can't tell them," he choked out, leaning into her touch just a fraction, starving for the comfort he had denied himself for months. "I can't break their hearts." "Their hearts are already broken," Cora said gently. "What they need isn't a dead angel, they need a living father. They need you. They need to know that you didn't drive her away, that her leaving wasn't their fault. They'll hate me for ruining her memory. They will love you for staying when she didn't." Cora moved closer, wrapping her arms around his broad, shaking shoulders. She pulled his head down to her chest, holding him in the damp, cold dirt of the root cellar. For the first time since his wife had died, Wyatt Hayes wept. He wrapped his massive arms around Cora's waist, burying his face in her shoulder, and let the agonizing, soul-tearing sobs tear through him. He cried for the betrayal of his marriage, for the money that was gone, for the terrified children sleeping upstairs, and for the sheer, exhausting terror of carrying the lie alone. Cora held him, rocking him slowly, her chin resting on the top of his dark head. She let him break. She knew better than anyone that sometimes a bone had to be completely rebroken before it could set straight and heal properly. They stayed there until the lantern began to sputter and die, the flame starving for oxygen. Wyatt's sobs eventually subsided into heavy, exhausted breaths. He didn't pull away immediately. He kept his face pressed to her shoulder, drawing comfort from her solid, unwavering presence. When he finally lifted his head, the hollow deadness in his eyes was gone. The grief was still there, but it was no longer a stagnant pool. It was a flowing river. He looked at Cora, really looked at her, his gaze dropping to her scarred arm, then back to her eyes. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper in the dying light. "You could have run. When you saw the shotgun, when you saw Silas. Why did you stay?" Cora looked down at the letters in the dirt, then back up at the man who had traded his soul for his children's peace. "Because I know what it's like to survive a fire, Wyatt," she said softly. "And I know you can't survive it if you stay in the burning house alone." Wyatt reached up, his rough fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was hesitant, as if he expected her to pull away. When she didn't, his hand cupped the back of her neck, his thumb resting over her pulse point. The air in the cellar shifted, the heavy grief suddenly tangling with a profound electric pull. "We have 3 weeks before Silas forecloses," Wyatt said, his thumb stroking her skin. "Then we have 3 weeks to figure out how to beat him," Cora replied, her voice steady, her eyes locking onto his. "But we don't do it with lies. We do it together." Wyatt stared at her mouth, then up to her eyes. Slowly, purposefully, he gave a single firm nod. The silence was broken. The truth was out. And for the first time in a year, Wyatt Hayes wasn't fighting alone. The sky did not simply turn gray. It bruised. By noon on a Thursday, the horizon to the north had blackened into the color of a fresh hematoma, swallowing the jagged peaks of the mountains in a churning wall of absolute dark. The temperature did not drop. It plummeted, the air turning sharp and brittle enough to snap in the lungs. The metallic scent of ozone and crushed ice heralded the arrival of the kind of storm that didn't just blanket the earth, but buried it. Wyatt stood on the porch, his eyes narrowed against the biting wind. He pulled his heavy shearling coat tighter, his jaw set like granite. "The wind shifted," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who read the sky like a grim scripture. "The stragglers. There's about 30 head of cattle still grazing up in the north draw. If this hits before they find the tree line, they'll freeze standing up. I have to go get them." Cora stepped out onto the porch, her canvas coat, freshly patched where the wolf had torn it, buttoned to her chin. She handed him his thick leather gloves. "I'll saddle the roan and the mare." Wyatt turned to her, shaking his head. "No, you stay here. Keep the fires roaring. Barricade the doors once I'm gone. A whiteout is coming, Cora. You can't see your own hand in front of your face in a Montana blizzard." "Which is exactly why you aren't going alone," Cora replied, her tone brooking absolutely no argument. She stepped past him, heading toward the barn. 30 head is too many for one rider to push out of a draw when the snow blinds them. They'll scatter. You need a flank rider. Wyatt caught her arm gently but firmly. Cora, I mean it. It's too dangerous. Cora looked at him. Since the revelation in the root cellar a week ago, the dynamic between them had shifted irrevocably. The walls were down, replaced by a quiet, intense partnership. He no longer looked at her as a hired hand, but as an equal. Wyatt, we can't afford to lose 30 head. Silas is waiting for us to default. If those cows die, the ranch dies with them. She pulled her arm free, her eyes fierce. I'm going. The kids know how to keep the stove hot. Wyatt stared at her stubbornly jutting chin, recognized the immovable will behind her eyes, and finally nodded. 5 minutes. We ride hard. They left the children with strict instructions. Abigail was in charge of the firewood and the heavy iron bolt on the door. Leo was tasked with keeping Buster inside and warm. Bessie was to stay away from the stove. 10 minutes later, Cora and Wyatt were riding north, pushing their horses into a fierce, punishing gallop. The storm hit them halfway to the draw. It didn't start with flurries. It hit like a physical blow. A wall of screaming white descended, instantly obliterating the landscape. The wind howled with a demonic pitch, driving crystalline shards of ice horizontally across the plains. Within seconds, Cora lost sight of the barn behind them. Within minutes, she could barely see the tail of Wyatt's horse 10 feet ahead. It was a whiteout. The world vanished, leaving only the agonizing, biting cold and the deafening roar of the blizzard. Cora pulled her scarf up over her nose, squinting through the slit between her hat brim and her wool collar. The cold seeped through her heavy coat, finding the marrow of her bones. Her scarred left arm ached with a deep, pulsing throb. They found the cattle huddled in a miserable, snow-caked mass at the base of a rocky outcropping in the north draw. The animals were lowing pitifully, their backs to the wind, already beginning to drift under the rapidly accumulating snow. Wyatt spurred his horse, yelling over the roar of the wind, swinging his lariat to break the herd's inertia. Cora flanked them on the right, her horse plunging through drifts that were already knee-deep. She slapped her reins against her chaps, shouting, pushing the massive, stubborn beasts forward. For an hour, it was a brutal, grueling war against nature. The cows were terrified and confused, wanting only to lie down and die. Cora and Wyatt had to physically force them into the wind, driving them step by agonizing step toward the safety of the ranch's winter pastures. The physical toll was immense. Cora couldn't feel her toes or fingers. Her eyelashes were frozen shut, requiring her to constantly brush the ice away just to see the blurry shapes of the cattle. And then the trauma hit. A massive pine tree on the ridge, overburdened by the sudden weight of the snow and battered by the gale-force winds, snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. The massive trunk crashed down, missing the rear of the herd by mere feet. But it wasn't the falling tree that triggered Cora. It was the sudden, blinding spray of white powder it kicked up, combined with the screaming wind and the absolute disorienting erasure of the horizon. Suddenly, Cora wasn't in Montana. She was in the Sierra Nevadas. She was 18 years old. The snow was 30 feet deep. The wagons were buried. The food was gone. And the fire. The desperate, raging fire they had built to signal for help. The fire that the wind had whipped into a frenzy, catching the canvas of her family's wagon. She could hear the screams. She could feel the blistering heat cooking the skin of her arm as she reached into the flames, trying to pull her little sister out, only to pull back a burning brand. Cora's horse whinnied, sensing its rider's sudden total panic. Cora dropped the reins. She couldn't breathe. Her chest seized. The whiteout wasn't just snow. It was the suffocating, freezing death that had taken her family. She was paralyzed, her mind trapped in a blazing inferno while her body froze to the saddle. "Cora!" Wyatt's voice cut through the roaring wind and the screaming memories. He had circled back when he noticed her horse wandering aimlessly. He rode up beside her, reaching out to grab her horse's bridle. Through the blur of the storm, he saw her face. It was completely slack with terror, her eyes wide, unseeing and dilated. She was gasping for air in shallow, frantic hitches. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He swung down from his saddle, plunging waist-deep into a drift, and waded to her side. He reached up, grabbed her by the waist, and practically pulled her out of the saddle. "Cora, look at me!" he yelled over the storm, holding her by the shoulders. She was shaking so violently her teeth were clicking together. She looked right through him, seeing only fire and snow. He needed to get her out of the wind. They were on the edge of the draw, near the base of the foothills. Wyatt knew the land blindly. He slung his arm around her waist, half carrying, half dragging her through the drifts, leading the horses by the reins. Less than 50 yards away, tucked beneath a massive overhanging shelf of granite, was a shallow cave. Yeah. It wasn't deep, but it broke the wind completely and offered a dry floor. Wyatt hauled Cora into the darkness of the overhang. The sudden cessation of the howling wind was jarring. He tied the horses near the entrance, using their bulk to block some of the cold. He turned back to Cora. She had collapsed against the stone wall, her knees pulled to her chest, rocking slightly, her uninjured hand clutching the scarred flesh of her left arm. She was trapped in a flashback, hyperventilating. Wyatt knelt in front of her. He didn't try to shake her out of it. He stripped off his heavy leather gloves and took her freezing, trembling hands in his large, warm ones. "Cora," he said. His voice wasn't a shout now. It was a deep, resonant, grounding rumble. "You are in Montana. You are with me, Wyatt. You are safe. Look at my face." He moved closer, his broad chest blocking the sight of the swirling snow outside. He rubbed her hands briskly, transferring his body heat. "Cora, come back to me." Slowly, agonizingly, the glassy terror in her eyes began to fracture. She blinked, a tear escaping and instantly freezing on her cheek. She focused on the rugged, bearded face in front of her. The gray eyes looking back at her were full of such intense, desperate care that it broke the spell. "The wagon," Cora gasped, her voice a ragged sob. "It was burning. The snow was so deep we couldn't run. I tried to pull her out." Wyatt didn't ask questions. He didn't ask who she was. He shifted his weight, pulling Cora forward until she was enveloped in his arms. He wrapped his heavy shearling coat around both of them, trapping their body heat together in the freezing dark of the cave. "I know," Wyatt murmured, his lips pressed to her snow-damp hair. "I've got you. I've got you." Cora buried her face in the crook of his neck, clinging to the lapels of his coat. In the freezing, desolate darkness of the cave, the final walls Cora had built to protect herself crumbled. "It was the Donner Route," she whispered against his skin, the confession tearing out of her. 3 years ago, a freak blizzard trapped our wagon train. We ran out of food. People went mad. My father tried to hike out for help and never came back. We tried to build a signal fire. The wind caught it. It burned our wagon. My little sister was inside. I reached through the canvas. The fire. I couldn't hold on to her. The scars." She sobbed, a sound of profound, unhealed agony. "I lived. Everyone else died, and I lived." Wyatt's arms tightened around her with crushing force, as if he could physically shield her from the memories. He understood trauma. He understood the agonizing guilt of surviving when others didn't. "You lived because you are a fighter, Cora," Wyatt said fiercely into her ear. "You lived so you could be here, with me, with my children. You are not a ghost, Cora. You are the most alive, terrifyingly strong woman I have ever known." Cora pulled back just enough to look at his face. The shadows of the cave hid nothing. The vulnerability between them was absolute, stripped bare by the cold and the truth. They were two shattered people, hiding in a cave from a blinding storm, realizing that the only warmth left in the world was each other. Wyatt's gaze dropped to her lips. The air between them suddenly felt suffocatingly hot, a sharp contrast to the freezing stone around them. Cora, he breathed, her name a prayer and a desperate plea. She didn't hesitate. She reached up, her hands tangling in his dark hair, and pulled him down. The kiss was not gentle. It was not a slow, romantic awakening. It was desperate, bruising, and life-affirming. It was a collision of two souls starving for connection, pouring years of grief, loneliness, and repressed passion into a single, explosive point of contact. Wyatt's mouth was hot and demanding, his large hands sliding down to grip her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. Cora answered with equal ferocity, opening her mouth to him, kissing him like a drowning woman stealing breath from her rescuer. It was messy, frantic, and entirely perfect. For a suspended moment in time, the blizzard outside ceased to exist. Silas Thorne didn't exist. Margaret's ghost was finally exorcised, burned away by the sheer, undeniable reality of the present. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, their foreheads resting against each other, the silence in the cave was thick with a new, profound understanding. Wyatt opened his eyes, staring into hers. The deadness was gone. The cowboy was awake. "We have to get back to the kids," Cora whispered, her lips swollen, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. Wyatt nodded slowly, stealing one last lingering kiss before pulling back. "The storm is breaking slightly. The wind is dying down. Is dying. We can follow the ridge back." They mounted the shivering horses and waded back out into the snow. The whiteout had lifted, leaving behind a world buried in 3 feet of powder, but visibility had improved to a few hundred yards. The cattle were gone, having thankfully followed the draw down to the lower sheltered pastures. But as they rode down the foothills, the landscape was completely altered. The snow had erased the road, the fences, and all familiar landmarks. Wyatt paused, his horse chest deep in a drift, looking around with a tightening jaw. They were disoriented. If they rode in the wrong direction, they would wander into the open plains and freeze to death before morning. The wind howled, mocking them. And then, cutting through the howl of the storm, came a sound. Clang, clang, clang. It was rhythmic, sharp, and metallic. Wyatt and Cora froze, turning their heads toward the sound. Clang, clang, clang. "The dinner bell," Wyatt breathed, disbelief coloring his voice. It was coming from the south. They spurred their exhausted horses, fighting through the drifts, following the lifeline of the sound. As they crested a small rise, a glowing orange beacon pierced the gloom. It was the Hayes cabin. Standing on the snow-swept front porch, leaning against the heavy wooden railing, was Abigail. She was holding a kerosene lantern high above her head, the light a fierce, defiant star against the gray. And beside her, standing on a wooden crate so he could reach the heavy rope, was 6-year-old Leo. The little boy, who hadn't made a sound in a year, was throwing his entire body weight onto the rope of the massive cast-iron dinner bell, ringing it with a desperate, furious rhythm. Clang, clang, clang. Tears, hot and fast, blurred Cora's vision. She looked at Wyatt. The tough, silent cowboy was openly weeping, the tears freezing in his beard as he looked at his children, standing as a beacon in the storm to guide him home. They rode into the yard. Before Wyatt even fully dismounted, the cabin door flew open. Abigail dropped the lantern and ran into the snow, followed closely by Leo. Wyatt dropped to his knees in the drifts, catching both his children as they slammed into his chest. He buried his face in their hair, his massive arms wrapping around them, holding them tight against his heart. Cora watched them from the saddle, a profound sense of peace settling over her, despite the freezing cold. She had lost a family in the snow years ago, but today, the snow had guided her to a new one. Abigail looked up from her father's shoulder, her gray eyes finding Cora still on her horse. The 12-year-old girl didn't glare. She didn't scowl. She reached out a small, cold hand toward Cora. "You came back," Abigail said, her voice trembling. Cora swung down from the saddle, walking through the snow, and took the girl's hand. "We always will," Cora promised, and for the first time in 3 years, she knew it was the absolute truth. The morning after the blizzard broke bright, clear, and blindingly cruel. The Montana sky was a vast, indifferent dome of cobalt blue, reflecting off the 3 feet of pristine snow that buried the Hayes Ranch. But the deceptive beauty of the morning could not hide the devastation the storm had left in its wake. Wyatt and Cora spent the daylight hours wading through chest-high drifts to assess the damage. It was a grim, silent procession. While the majority of the herd had made it to the sheltered draws, the stragglers had not been so lucky. They found a dozen head of cattle frozen solid against the fence lines. Worse still, the heavy snow accumulation had collapsed the roof of the old calving shed, crushing several of the pregnant heifers Wyatt had been relying on for the spring payout. Cora watched Wyatt walk among the dead livestock. He didn't curse or throw his hat in the snow. He simply moved from carcass to carcass, his face a mask of carved granite, occasionally drawing his Colt revolver to put a merciful end to a beast with a shattered leg. Every gunshot echoing across the frozen valley was the sound of another nail being driven into the coffin of the Hayes Ranch. When they finally trudged back into the cabin, the warmth of the cast-iron stove felt like a mockery of the cold reality they faced. Abigail was feeding Bessie a bowl of oats, while Leo sat quietly by the fire, whittling a piece of pine. The children looked up, their eyes searching their father's face for reassurance. Wyatt offered none. He unbuttoned his heavy shearling coat and sank into the chair at the head of the table, burying his face in his scarred, exhausted hands. 20 head lost, Wyatt said, his voice a hollow rasp. The calving shed is gone. Even if I sold every surviving cow tomorrow at a premium, it wouldn't cover half of what we owe Silas. Before Cora could offer a word of comfort, the sound of an approaching horse broke the heavy silence. Wyatt stood instantly, his hand dropping to his side. Cora stepped to the window, peering through the frost-rimmed glass. It wasn't Silas's black carriage. It was a lone rider, a deputy from town, bundled heavily against the cold. Wyatt opened the door before the man could knock. The deputy didn't dismount. He looked uncomfortable, avoiding Wyatt's direct, stormy gaze as he handed down a thick, wax-sealed envelope. "Sorry, Wyatt," the deputy muttered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Mr. Thorne insisted I ride out first thing. Formal notice." Wyatt took the envelope without a word. He closed the door, breaking the seal with a heavy thumb. He unfolded the thick parchment. Cora watched his jaw clench, the muscles ticking dangerously beneath his beard. He didn't read it aloud, but he didn't hide it from her either. He set it on the table and stepped back. Cora leaned forward. It was a formal notice of foreclosure, drafted with legal precision, but tucked behind the official document was a handwritten note on Silas's personal stationery. "Hayes, the grace period ends in 1 week. Do not think the storm has bought you time. I know you found the chest in the cellar. I know you have her letter. Burn it. Hand over the deed quietly and walk away. If you try to fight me, I will take this to the territorial judge. I will testify that Margaret begged me to save her from a violent, abusive husband. I will make sure the whole county knows she died trying to escape you. And as for your new housekeeper, I have friends in California who tell interesting stories about a wagon train fire and a girl who left her family to burn. Hand over the ranch, or I will see you ruined and her hanged for negligence. S. Thorne." The air in the cabin grew instantly toxic. Silas wasn't just foreclosing, he was holding their darkest traumas hostage. He was threatening to rewrite history, turning Margaret into a martyr and Wyatt into a monster, all while threatening to drag Cora's tragic past into a corrupt courtroom. "He's bluffing about California," Cora said, her voice tight but steady. "There was an inquiry. I was cleared. He has nothing but rumors." "Rumors are enough for a corrupt judge," Wyatt said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He looked at the children, who were watching them with wide, frightened eyes. He looked around the cabin, at the walls he had built with his own 2 hands. "I'll pack the wagon," Wyatt said softly. Cora stared at him, stunned. "What?" "I said I'll pack the wagon," Wyatt repeated, turning away from her. "We have a week. I can sell the remaining herd to the Johnson brothers a few miles over. It'll be enough for train tickets. We can go to Oregon. Start over. Wyatt, you can't be serious. You're just going to hand it to him? Wyatt spun around, his gray eyes blazing with a sudden desperate fury. What choice do I have, Cora? He has the law in his pocket. If I fight him, he ruins Margaret's memory for the kids, and he comes after you. I won't let him put you in a cage, and I won't let my children grow up hearing their mother was a whore and a thief. So you let him win, Cora shot back, stepping directly into his space, refusing to back down. You let him take your home, your pride, and everything you've bled for, just because he threatens to tell a truth you're too scared to face? I am trying to protect my family, Wyatt roared. Running isn't protecting, Cora yelled right back. It's surrendering. Silas won't stop, Wyatt. Men like him never do. If you run, he'll know he owns you. You have to stand your ground. Wyatt breathed heavily, staring down at her scarred, fierce face. For a moment, the tension between them was electric, the lingering heat from the cave warring with the bitter reality of their situation. Then, the fight drained out of him. He looked at Abigail, who was trembling by the stove. I can't fight him without the money, Cora, Wyatt whispered, his voice cracking. And I don't have it. He grabbed his hat and walked out the door, needing the freezing air to clear his head. Cora stood in the quiet cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the foreclosure notice on the table. $500. It was an impossible sum, but as she looked at Leo, who had crept out from under the stairs and was gripping her skirt, an iron resolve settled over her. Wyatt was right about one thing. They needed the money to strip Silas of his legal leverage. Once the debt was paid, his threats of taking the ranch evaporated. Cora walked over to her rucksack tucked beneath her cot. She dug deep into the bottom, past the spare ammunition and the mending kits, until her fingers brushed against a small velvet-wrapped bundle. She pulled it out and unrolled the fabric. Inside rested a heavy, intricately carved gold pocket watch on a thick chain, adorned with a flawless 2-carat sapphire. It was the only thing of value her father had owned, a family heirloom passed down for 3 generations. She had managed to pry it from the ashes of the wagon before she stumbled into the snow 3 years ago. She had sworn she would starve before she sold it. It was the last piece of her bloodline. But looking at the Hayes children, and thinking of the man who had held her in the dark and made her feel alive again, Cora knew some things were worth more than gold and memory. I protect what I consider home. Wyatt was out in the far pasture dealing with the carcasses. He would be gone for hours. Cora turned to Abigail. I need to go into Bozeman. I'll be back before nightfall. Do not tell your father I left. Abigail looked at the gold watch in Cora's hand, understanding dawning in her sharp gray eyes. She didn't argue. She simply nodded. Ride the roan. He handles the deep snow better. Cora smiled grimly. She strapped on her gun belt, grabbed her heavy coat, and walked out to saddle the horse. She was going to buy Wyatt Hayes a miracle whether he wanted it or not. The ride to Bozeman was treacherous, the warming afternoon sun turning the packed snow into a slippery, muddy slush. Cora rode hard, the gold watch heavy in her pocket. The town of Bozeman was bustling despite the weather, a chaotic mix of miners, ranchers, and businessmen. Cora didn't go to Silas's bank. She went to the assayer's office, a cramped, heavily barred brick building at the edge of town. The assayer, a bespectacled man with ink-stained fingers, examined the watch through a jeweler's loop. His eyebrows rose. Exquisite craftsmanship. The sapphire alone is worth a small fortune. Where did a woman like you come by a piece like this? That is none of your concern, Cora said coldly, resting her hand on the butt of her revolver. I need cash, now, $500. The assayer swallowed hard, looking at her scarred arm and the hard, unyielding set of her jaw. I can give you $450. Not a penny more. The market for fine goods is soft right now. Cora calculated quickly. Wyatt had roughly $50 saved in a tin under the floorboards. It would be exactly enough. Deal. Big bills. 10 minutes later, Cora walked out of the assayer's office, a thick roll of greenbacks tucked securely inside her canvas coat. She felt a surge of fierce, protective triumph. She had it. They were going to save the ranch. Silas Thorne could take his threats and choke on them. But Cora had underestimated the reach of Silas's influence in a town he practically owned. As she mounted the roan and turned toward the trail leading out of town, she didn't notice the scruffy stable boy sprint away from the assayer's office and disappear into the alleyway behind the bank. The sun was beginning to dip below the jagged peaks as Cora reached the narrow canyon pass, about 2 miles from the Hayes Ranch. The shadows were lengthening, turning the snow an eerie, bruised purple. The hairs on the back of Cora's neck stood up. The silence of the canyon was wrong. There were no birds, no wind. She reined the roan in, her hand drifting toward the Winchester slung in the scabbard by her knee. Well, well, if it isn't the loyal little housekeeper. The voice echoed off the canyon walls. From behind an outcropping of gray rock, 3 riders emerged, blocking the narrow trail. In the center sat Silas Thorne, bundled in an expensive fur-lined coat. Flanking him were 2 hard-looking men, hired guns with low-slung holsters and cruel smiles. Cora didn't panic. Cora didn't. Her mind went icy clear. "Get out of my way, Silas." "I don't think I will," Silas sneered, urging his horse forward a few paces. "Word reached me that you just walked out of the assayer's office with a very thick roll of cash. Now, where would a dusty little stray like you get that kind of money, I wonder? Stole it from Wyatt, perhaps. Or maybe you stole it in California. It's none of your business. It's my money, and it's going to pay off Wyatt's debt. You lose, Silas." Silas threw his head back and laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Oh, my dear naive girl. You think a piece of paper matters out here? You think I'm going to let you ride back to that dirt farm and hand Wyatt his salvation?" He drew a polished, ivory-handled revolver from his coat. "The money stays here. And unfortunately, you met with a tragic accident on the treacherous winter roads. A real shame." He nodded to his men. The 2 hired guns drew their weapons. Cora didn't wait to be executed. With a sharp whistle, she spurred the roan, violently jerking the reins to the left, driving the horse up the steep, snow-covered embankment of the canyon wall. Gunfire erupted. Bullets cracked through the freezing air, kicking up plumes of snow inches from the roan's hooves. Cora drew her Winchester in a smooth, practiced motion. She didn't aim for the men, she aimed for a larger target. Twisting in the saddle, she fired a round directly into the dirt at the hooves of the closest thug's horse. The animal shrieked, rearing up wildly and throwing its rider into a snowbank. But the terrain was against her. The roan lost its footing on the slippery shale hidden beneath the snow. The horse scrambled, whinnying in panic, and went down hard on its front knees. Cora was thrown from the saddle, tumbling painfully down the snowy embankment and crashing into the base of a massive pine tree. Her rifle flew from her grasp, landing 10 yards away in a deep drift. Cora groaned, her vision swimming. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, her scarred arms screaming in protest. She heard the crunch of boots on snow. Silas and his remaining hired gun walked toward her. The thug had his gun trained on her chest. Silas stood over her, an expression of supreme, arrogant victory on his handsome face. "Check her coat," Silas ordered. The thug stepped forward, reaching out to grab Cora. Before his hand could make contact, a sound sliced through the canyon, the high, sharp whistle of braided leather cutting through the air. A heavy hemp lariat dropped from the sky, the loop perfectly dropping over the thug's shoulders and pinning his arms to his sides. The rope snapped taut with the force of a freight train. The thug was yanked violently backward, his feet flying out from under him. He hit the snow with a sickening thud, his gun flying into the brush, and was rapidly dragged away into the shadows of the tree line. Silas spun around, his eyes wide with sudden terror, raising his ivory-handled revolver. A gunshot cracked like thunder. It didn't come from the ground. It came from the ridge 20 feet above them. Silas screamed as the gun was literally blasted out of his hand, a bullet shattering the ivory grip and tearing a gruesome gash across his knuckles. He fell to his knees, clutching his bleeding, mangled hand against his chest. From the top of the snowy ridge, a shadow detached itself from the rocks. Wyatt Hayes spurred his massive black gelding down the steep, treacherous incline. He rode with the reckless, terrifying grace of a true horseman. the animal practically sliding down the shale on its haunches. Wyatt didn't look like a defeated dirt farmer. He looked like the spirit of vengeance, dark and relentless. His gray eyes were murderously cold, a smoking Colt revolver held steady in his right hand. He brought the horse to a sliding halt inches from Silas. Without a word, Wyatt swung down from the saddle. Silas scrambled backward in the snow, leaving a trail of blood, his arrogance entirely shattered. "Wait, Hayes, wait! The law! You can't! I'm the bank president!" Wyatt holstered his gun. He stepped forward, grabbed Silas by the lapels of his expensive fur-lined coat, and hoisted the man effortlessly to his feet. "Out here," Wyatt said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated in Cora's chest. "I am the law." Wyatt threw a massive right hook, burying his fist directly into Silas's jaw. The banker's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed into the snow, unconscious before he hit the ground. Wyatt didn't spare him a second glance. He turned and immediately dropped to his knees in the snow beside Cora. The lethal, cold anger vanished from his face, replaced by a frantic, desperate fear. "Cora," he breathed, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her and find her broken. "Are you hit? Did they hit you?" "No," Cora gasped, sitting up and clutching her ribs. "Just bruised. The horse is fine. It's up." Wyatt reached out, pulling her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. He buried his face in her neck, his broad shoulders shaking. "God almighty, Cora. When Abigail told me you went to town, when I saw their tracks following you into the canyon..." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs brushing the snow from her cheeks. His eyes were blazing. "Don't you ever do something that reckless again. I don't care about the ranch. I don't care about the money. I won't lose you." Cora reached inside her coat, pulling out the thick roll of greenbacks, and pressed it against his chest. "I didn't do it to be reckless," she said fiercely, holding his gaze. "I did it because I'm not letting that snake run us off our land. The debt is paid, Wyatt. He has nothing on us anymore." Wyatt looked at the money, then down at the unconscious, bleeding banker in the snow. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of the frontier justice that was about to unfold. Wyatt stood up, pulling Cora with him. He walked over to his horse, grabbed a length of thick rope from his saddle, and walked back to Silas. "What are you doing?" Cora asked. Wyatt began binding Silas's wrists together with tight, unforgiving knots. "I'm not handing him over to a corrupt sheriff in Bozeman so he can buy his way out by morning." He hauled the unconscious banker up and draped him over the back of Silas's own horse like a sack of grain, tying his ankles to the stirrups. Wyatt turned to Cora, his eyes hard as iron but glowing with a fierce protective light. "We're taking him back to the ranch," Wyatt said softly. "It's time Silas Thorne learned exactly what happens when you threaten my family." The cowboy was silent no longer, and the war for the Hayes Ranch had just truly begun. They did not tie Silas Thorne in the house. He was dragged, kicking and bleeding, into the heavy timber tack room of the main barn and lashed to a support beam. Wyatt confiscated the banker's custom-tailored coat, leaving him shivering in his ruined waistcoat. Night had fallen over the Hayes Ranch, thick and starless. The air was bitterly cold, but inside the cabin, the tension burned white-hot. "They'll come for him," Wyatt said, systematically loading a second six-shooter by the light of the kitchen lantern. "Silas has half the hired guns in Bozeman on his payroll. When he doesn't return, his men will track his horse right to our front door." Cora sat at the table, methodically sliding thick brass cartridges into the loading gate of her Winchester. She had changed out of her blood-stained clothes and into a tough canvas shirt, her scarred left arm wrapped tight. "Let them come. We have the high ground, the heavy timber walls, and the money." Wyatt looked at the thick roll of greenbacks resting on the oak table. $500. The price of his freedom, bought with Cora's only piece of her past. He reached out and covered her hand with his, stopping her movements. "I won't let them touch you, Cora," he vowed, his voice a low, vibrating promise. "Or the children." "I know," she said, holding his stormy gaze. "And I won't let them touch you." They plunged the cabin into darkness, extinguishing the lanterns to ruin the night vision of anyone approaching from the yard. Wyatt took his position at the front window, slightly cracked to allow the barrel of his rifle to rest on the sill. Cora took the loft window above, giving her a sweeping view of the snow-covered property. Abigail was instructed to stay in the root cellar with Leo and Bessie, the heavy trapdoor bolted from the inside. For 2 hours, the only sound was the wind howling off the northern ridges. Then Buster growled. It was a low, vibrating sound from beneath the porch. A moment later, the old dog erupted into furious, frantic barking. "Cora!" Wyatt's voice drifted up from the dark room below. "I see them," she whispered back. Shadows detached themselves from the tree line. Not 3 men. A dozen. Silas hadn't just hired thugs. He had bought a small army to ensure the destruction of the Hayes Ranch. They didn't ride in boldly. They crept through the snow, fanning out to encircle the cabin and the barn. Then the darkness was violently shattered. A match flared. A rag soaked in kerosene ignited. A rider galloped past the barn, hurling the flaming torch into the hayloft window. The dry winter hay caught instantly. Within seconds, the roof of the barn was engulfed in a roaring, hungry sheet of orange flame. "Silas is in there!" Cora shouted, chambering around. "Let him burn!" Wyatt roared back, already opening fire on the riders in the yard. But Wyatt was a better man than his anger. As the barn doors caught fire, casting demonic dancing shadows across the blood-stained snow, Wyatt cursed violently. "Cover me!" He kicked the front door open and sprinted across the open yard, plunging into the smoke and chaos. Cora laid down, suppressing fire from the loft window. Her Winchester barked rhythmically, crack lever, sending 3 thugs diving for cover behind the frozen water troughs. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, a hail of lead splintering the logs of the cabin. Cora dropped low, shards of glass showering her back as the window shattered. She popped back up, firing at the muzzle flashes in the dark. Wyatt emerged from the burning barn, dragging a coughing, terrified Silas Thorne by the collar. He hurled the banker into the snow behind the heavy stone well, using it as cover. Wyatt raised his revolvers, firing with deadly, ambidextrous precision, dropping a rider who tried to flank them. The heat from the burning barn was intense, melting the snow in the yard and turning the ground into a slick, muddy nightmare. "Burn the house!" a voice yelled from the darkness. "Burn them out!" 2 men broke from the cover of the woods, carrying lit torches, sprinting frantically toward the cabin porch. Cora tracked the first one, squeezed the trigger, and watched him drop, his torch sizzling out in the snow. But her rifle clicked empty. The second man was closing in. He reached the porch, his arm drawing back to hurl the fire through the shattered window. Cora scrambled for her revolver, but it was too late. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the cabin flew open. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the dark interior, was 12-year-old Abigail. Her feet were planted shoulder-width apart. Her weight was shifted forward. The heavy double-barreled shotgun was tucked tightly into the pocket of her shoulder. Boom! The deafening roar of the 10-gauge shotgun eclipsed the sound of the burning barn. The buckshot caught the thug squarely in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward off the porch. His torch fell harmlessly into the mud. Abigail staggered back a step from the brutal recoil. But she didn't fall. She broke the action, the empty shell pinging on the floorboards, and slammed a fresh one in with trembling, blood-stained hands. "Abigail, get back in the cellar!" Cora screamed, vaulting down the loft stairs. But the battle was shifting. Silas's men, seeing the barn fully engulfed and taking heavy casualties from the fierce, entrenched resistance, were losing their nerve. They were paid to intimidate a broken farmer, not to fight a heavily armed fortress. One by one, they began to retreat into the tree line, spurring their horses away from the inferno. Cora rushed out onto the porch, grabbing Abigail and pulling her behind the thick logs of the door frame. Out in the yard, Wyatt stepped out from behind the stone well. His face was streaked with soot and sweat, his eyes glowing like hot coals in the firelight. He grabbed Silas by the ruined lapels of his coat and hauled him to his feet. Silas was trembling uncontrollably, coughing up black smoke, his pristine world entirely destroyed. Suddenly, from the shadows beside the cabin, a lone figure lunged. It was the thug whose horse Cora had shot in the canyon, the one Wyatt had roped. He had crept through the smoke, bypassing the firefight, his eyes fixed on the woman who had humiliated him. He raised a heavy hunting knife, closing the distance to Cora's unprotected back in 3 silent, deadly strides. Cora didn't see him. Wyatt was too far away, his view blocked by the burning barn doors, but someone else did. From the doorway of the cabin, a small, terrified figure emerged. Little Leo, clutching his wooden carving, his eyes wide with absolute horror. The trauma that had stolen his voice a year ago had built a wall of silence around him. But seeing the knife descending toward the woman who had fed him, who had fought wolves for him, who had finally made his father smile, shattered that wall completely. Leo took a breathless gasp and screamed, his voice tearing through the chaotic night with a shrill, piercing clarity. "Mama, look out!" Cora's instincts, honed on the edge of a knife, took over. She didn't turn to look. She dropped to the muddy floorboards, rolling violently to her right just as the heavy blade buried itself deep into the doorframe where her spine had been a fraction of a second before. Abigail didn't hesitate. She pivoted, the heavy shotgun tracking the thug. She squeezed the second trigger. The blast caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him violently into the yard, where he collapsed in a groaning, bloody heap. Cora scrambled to her feet, her chest heaving. She looked at Abigail, who lowered the smoking gun, pale but resolute. Then Cora looked at Leo. The little boy was standing on the porch, his chest heaving, tears streaming down his dirty face. Cora ran to him, dropping to her knees and wrapping her arms around his small, trembling body. "I've got you," she sobbed, burying her face in his neck. "I'm right here. I'm safe." Leo wrapped his arms around her neck, burying his face in her canvas coat. "Mama," he whispered again, the word clumsy but undeniably real. In the center of the yard, Wyatt stood over Silas Thorne. The banker was on his knees in the freezing mud, surrounded by the bodies of his hired men and the roaring flames of the barn he had tried to destroy. Silas looked up at Wyatt, a desperate, cornered rat. He spat a mouthful of blood. "You think you've won, Hayes? The barn is gone. Half your herd will freeze. You're ruined. And I'll still tell the whole territory what a lying, cheating whore your wife was. I'll make sure your kids hear every dirty detail." Wyatt looked down at the man who had haunted him for a year. He looked at the burning barn, the ashes falling like black snow around them. Then he looked at the porch. He saw Cora kneeling in the dirt, holding his son who had just spoken his first word in a year. He saw his daughter standing tall with a shotgun, defending her home instead of hiding from it. The heavy, suffocating burden Wyatt had carried, the shame, the secret of Margaret's betrayal, suddenly dissolved. Silas's weapon was useless, because Wyatt was no longer afraid of the truth. Wyatt holstered his gun. He reached down, grabbed Silas by the collar, and dragged him entirely into the light of the flames. "Tell them," Wyatt said, his voice ringing out, clear and resonant. Silas blinked, confused. "What?" "I said tell them," Wyatt repeated, his voice carrying the immovable weight of a mountain. "Tell the whole damn territory. Print it in the papers. Print it in the... Margaret abandoned us. She stole the money. She hated this ranch. Tell everyone." Wyatt leaned down, his face inches from Silas's battered, bleeding nose. "You can take her memory, Silas. You can burn my barn. But look at my family." Wyatt pointed to the porch. "Look at the woman holding my son. Look at my daughter. You have absolutely nothing I care about, and you can never ever touch what is mine." Wyatt released his grip. Silas slumped backward into the mud, pathetic, broken, and utterly stripped of his power. "Get off my land," Wyatt commanded, "before I change my mind and let the wolves have you." Silas scrambled to his feet, clutching his broken hand, and stumbled blindly into the dark, a ruined man running into the freezing night. Wyatt turned his back on the flames. He walked across the muddy yard, his boots heavy, his face streaked with soot and blood. He stopped at the edge of the porch, looking down at Cora, Leo, and Abigail. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He dropped to his knees in the mud, wrapping his massive arms around all of them, pulling them into a fierce, unbreakable embrace as the barn burned against the Montana sky. Dawn broke over the Hayes Ranch like a hesitant apology. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, illuminating the devastation in stark clarity. The main barn was a smoldering ruin, a skeletal framework of blackened timbers hissing as the snow melted into the ash. The air smelled of wet charcoal and cold earth. Cora stood on the back porch, a steaming mug of black coffee in her hands. Her body ached in places she didn't know she had muscles. Her left arm throbbed, and a dark purple bruise was blooming across her cheekbone from her fall in the canyon. She watched Wyatt ride into the yard. He had left before first light. But he wasn't riding the massive black gelding. He was riding a borrowed, sway-backed mare from the Johnson brothers' ranch down the valley. He dismounted slowly, tying the mare to the surviving fence post. He looked exhausted, his shoulders heavy, but there was a strange, profound peace in his gray eyes that hadn't been there since she arrived. He walked up the porch steps, pulling a folded piece of heavy parchment from his coat pocket. He handed it to her. Cora unfolded it. It was the deed to the Hayes Ranch. Stamped across the front in heavy red ink was the word, "Satisfied." "The debt is cleared," Wyatt said quietly. "Silas is in custody in Bozeman. The assayer testified about his thugs attacking you. He's facing 10 years in the territorial prison for attempted murder and arson." Cora looked at the paper, relief washing over her. "We did it. We saved the ranch." "I sold the roan," Wyatt added, looking out at the smoldering barn. Cora's head snapped up. "Wyatt, no. That stallion was your prize. He was your breeding stock." "He was a horse, Cora," Wyatt said gently, turning back to her. "I used your $450 to pay the principal. I sold the roan to the Johnsons to cover the interest and to buy enough lumber to rebuild the barn before the deep winter sets in. It's done. We are free and clear." Cora stared at him, the weight of his sacrifice settling heavily in her chest. He had given up his most prized possession to ensure they didn't owe a dime to anyone. He had chosen survival, chosen his family over his pride. But as Cora looked at the ashes blowing across the yard, a dark, familiar shadow crept into her mind. Fire and death. She had brought violence to his doorstep. She had almost gotten Abigail killed. She had been the reason Silas's men had nearly murdered him in the canyon. She was a woman carrying the scars of a burned wagon, and now the man she loved had a burned barn. She was a curse. Cora handed the deed back to him, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'll go pack my rucksack." Wyatt froze. The peace in his eyes vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated shock. "What?" Cora couldn't meet his gaze. She looked down at the muddy floorboards. "The debt is paid, Wyatt. Silas is gone. The children... Leo is talking again. Abigail knows how to shoot. You don't need a housekeeper anymore to keep them alive. And I attract ruin. Everything I touch burns, Wyatt. It's better if I catch the stagecoach back to Bozeman before the roads freeze over entirely." She turned to walk back into the cabin, her heart shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces with every step. She didn't make it to the door. Wyatt's large hand wrapped around her wrist, spinning her back around. He didn't let go. He reached down with his other hand, unbuckling the heavy gun belt strapped around her waist. He let the Winchester and the leather scabbard drop heavily onto the porch boards with a loud thud. "What are you doing?" Cora gasped, tears finally spilling over her lashes. Wyatt didn't answer. He reached up, his rough, calloused thumbs gently wiping the soot and tears from her bruised cheeks. He looked down at her, his stormy gray eyes burning with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. "Do you want me to stay because you need a housekeeper?" Cora cried, her voice breaking, the agonizing insecurity of a lifetime pouring out. Because you need a mother for them? Or because you need me? Wyatt Hayes, the man who had spent a year drowning in silence, didn't offer a long, eloquent speech. He didn't try to argue with her trauma or debate her fears. He simply stepped forward, sliding his hands to the back of her neck, and brought his mouth down on hers. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke, coffee, and absolute, undeniable permanence. It was a brand on her soul, a physical declaration that she belonged to him, to this land, to this family, and that he would fight God himself before he let her walk away. Cora gasped against his mouth, her hands instinctively coming up to grip his heavy shearling coat, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in her world. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. Wyatt reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of official county-stamped paper and pressed it into her trembling hands. Cora looked down through her tears. It was a territorial marriage certificate. It was already signed by the county clerk in Bozeman, dated that very morning. The groom's name was written in Wyatt's heavy, deliberate script. The line for the bride's name was blank, waiting only for her signature. Cora looked up from the paper, her breath catching in her throat. Wyatt looked at her, his eyes shining with a profound, terrifying vulnerability and an unconditional, earth-shattering love. The cowboy stayed silent, and that said more than any words could. Cora didn't pack her rucksack. She dropped the marriage certificate onto the porch railing, threw her arms around Wyatt's neck, and buried her face in his chest, weeping not from grief, but from the overwhelming, terrifying joy of finally, truly, coming home. 1 year later. The Montana autumn was a riot of gold and crimson. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and roasting apples from the kitchen. Cora stood on the back porch of the Hayes Ranch. The yard was no longer a muddy, desolate wasteland. The fences stood straight and strong. A massive, newly built barn, painted a cheerful barn red, dominated the landscape, filled with the sounds of healthy cattle and stamping horses. She leaned against the heavy wooden railing, her hand resting on the swell of her rounded belly, feeling the strong, steady kick of the child growing inside her. The heavy oak door swung open behind her. "Mama, Mama, look!" 7-year-old Leo sprinted onto the porch, his face smeared with dirt and a massive, gap-toothed grin stretching ear to ear. He was holding a perfectly carved wooden horse. He didn't whisper. He shouted it to the world. "That is beautiful, Leo," Cora smiled, ruffling his dark hair. "Show your father." In the yard, Wyatt was helping Abigail saddle a young Mustang. The 12-year-old was no longer a feral, angry child. She sat tall in the saddle, confident and fierce, laughing as the Mustang pranced nervously. Bessie was sitting on the porch steps, wrapped snugly in a beautiful, intricately stitched quilt. A tapestry of blues and creams that Cora and Abigail had sewn together over the long winter, stitching over the memories of the past with the warmth of the present. Wyatt handed Abigail the reins and walked toward the porch. He moved with an easy, rolling stride, the heavy burden of the past entirely lifted from his broad shoulders. He stepped up onto the porch, scooping Leo up with one arm and wrapping his other arm securely around Cora's waist. He kissed the top of Cora's head, his hand resting gently over hers on her stomach. "Storm's coming in tonight," Wyatt said, looking toward the northern ridge. But his voice held no fear, no dread of the winter. Cora leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children play in the yard, feeling the solid, unbreakable warmth of the man beside her. "Let it come," Cora said softly, a smile touching her lips. "We've got plenty of firewood." Wyatt turned his head, his gray eyes locking onto hers, full of an endless, quiet devotion. He smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression that still made her heart skip a beat. He didn't say a word. He just pulled her closer, kissing her under the vast, golden Montana sky. And in the perfect, peaceful silence of the ranch they had fought and bled to save, no words were necessary at all.